All right, so this lecture is going to cover language from, what is it, chapter 3? Chapter 3, okay. All right, very good. So we just did our little exercise about opposite words, etc., and the main gist of that is we're supposed to learn that when you use opposite terms in the English language, we become very polemic in our thinking. All right? We can start to think to the extremes. Right and wrong, left and right, etc., and we have a hard time meeting in the middle. And this is important for us for lots of different reasons. One of those is our interpersonal relationships. All right, so when you're fighting, how do you fight? You'll often say something like, "You always forget," or "You never pick up your socks." We use those words always and never because we can think polemically to the extremes, and we don't live in the middle. All right, so language is important. It actually changes the way that we think. All right, so with regards to that, there's one little theory in your book called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is based in linguistic relativism. So with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, it talks about the way that our language functions, the actual grammar of our language, the presence or absence of vocabulary, changes the way that we see the world. All right, for instance, in your reading, it talks about a Hopi tribe. And in this Hopi tribe, they have a word for one, and they have a word for two. They also have a word for three or more. But whether it be a 3 or a 4, they use the same word for it. So it was tested on whether this would actually impact the way that they see the world. And the researchers would put down before them 1 nut or 2 nuts and just simply ask them which is more. And when it was 1 or 2, they could tell the difference. When it was 2 or 3, they could tell the difference. But when it was comparing 3 to 4, they weren't able to tell which was more because they only had one word for it. That's really hard for us to comprehend because, for instance, with us, if I put 99 nuts down in front of you and a pile of 100 nuts in front of you, as long as I give you time to count them, 99 times out of 100, you're probably going to be able to tell me which one's correct because we have words for it and we're able to see it. Okay, now let's see this sucker in action. Anybody tell me what that is?
Fishing pole for donuts.
It's a fishing pole. Yeah. All right. It's a key. At least it's supposed to be. If we were playing Pictionary, we might win. All right. So, for instance, in the Spanish language, I believe, I have it on good authority, that perhaps that the word key is a masculine term. But I think that's in the Italian language, it's a feminine term. So when people are asked to describe a key, if it's in the Spanish language and it's a masculine one, they tend to use words like hard, sturdy, functional, strong. But in the Italian language, where it's feminine, they use things like sleek, slender, golden. So the actual grammar that accompanies the word changes the way that we see the object itself. And that's what Sapir and Whorf would have us believe. That we actually live in a world where the way that we use words changes the way that we see the word and see the world. All right. So how many of you have had a time, I don't know, where you're in a fight, somebody insults you, or maybe there's a joke that's going around and you're participating in a conversation, and then you're on your way home and suddenly the perfect comeback comes into your mind? Right? But it's too late. Or perhaps you didn't judge it correctly and you are a little bit late, but you think maybe there's still time for you to do it. And so you say, clam chowder. That was like 5 minutes ago, Johnny. Not cool. Right? The French actually have a term for that, and it's been a while since I've taken French, so if this is wrong, please don't sue me. But it's something like this. Escalier de wit. Right? Yeah. Joyce DeWitt. Escalier de wit. And what they mean by that is, it's the width of the staircase. And what they mean by that is, somebody's talking to you at the bottom of the staircase, and by the time you climb to the top, that's when you think of your response. And your response is a little too late. Right? So actually having a term to describe that feeling makes it much more likely the next time you're a little late on your comeback that you'll actually be able to identify what you're going through, because now we have a label for it. the width of the staircase. How many of you have also had this experience where you're trying to find a word or a term and you know what it is, but it won't quite come to you and it's annoying? Maybe name of a song, name of an artist. I don't know. They say it's on the tip of my tongue, but you can't remember what that is. The actual technical term for that is lethologica. Lethologica. That's where you know the word, but it just won't come to you. All right? So now that you know the term, the next time you experience that, you're going to be able to label that a little bit better. And you won't just experience it in passing now. You'll actually be able to brand it and label it. The fact that I've given you new vocabulary for this experience changes the way you experience it. You've now got the width of the staircase and lethological vocabulary, so you won't experience it the same next time that happens.
Unless it won't come to you.
Unless lethologica won't come to you, and that's on the tip of your tongue. Ironically, that's possible. All right? I know there's a word that describes this. But you'll have this on video now that we're letting you record it. All right? So you can go refer to it. All right, so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis talks about the fact that the way that we use our language and the fact that we either do or do not have words changes the way we see things. And just as a reminder, that's what that Jonathan example was getting at. How many of you have had a situation now where you're in the back of class and you start to notice people's Jonathan? Okay? Now that the word is present, you start to experience the world in a little bit different way. All right, so in communication, we want you to be aware of this, the way that the words impact the way that we see things. And we want you to move from being receiver-centric or ethnocentric more towards being a cosmopolitan communicator. Right, so when we use the word receiver-centric or ethnocentric, this is a communicator who insists that the only possible interpretation of a communication transaction is their interpretation. The conversation must mean what I think it means. A cosmopolitan communicator is one who's aware in the midst of their conversations there are multiple possible ways that this communication transaction is being interpreted. Right, so I know that this is very common for some of you. This is what your arguments look like. You said you'd take me out on Friday night. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. And you get angry and angrier. Faces are getting red. Pretty soon, pots and pans are flying all around the house. All right? That's somebody who's being completely receiver-centric or ethnocentric. You're insisting that the way you interpreted the communication transaction is the only possible interpretation. Somebody who's cosmopolitan might take a step back and say, what made you think that that's what I said? What was said that makes you think that, etc. All right, so now you can focus on the actual communication transaction, and you might be able to remind somebody, I did say that we would go out on Friday night, but that was only if my Comm 101 teacher lightened up a little bit, didn't give me a bunch of homework, and guess what? That ain't happening. Right? After you write those papers in the field. Okay? So, cosmopolitan communicator is one who's able to see things from multiple perspectives. All right, for instance, if I were to say, Mike, this Saturday I'm actually doing a little bit of recruiting for people who I think have a lot of potential for speech and debate team. So this Saturday we're having a little bit of a barbecue here on campus. I'm wondering if you'd like to show up, maybe meet a couple of the speech and debate students, have some steak, etc. Would you like to? Yeah. Saturday around 2. Okay. All right? In our culture, I now consider this a binding verbal contract between the two of us. And I'm expecting you to show up on Saturday. Not really, because I can't afford shrimp and steak. Right? But that's what we expect in our culture. He said yes. Yes is supposed to mean yes. No is supposed to mean no. And that's the end of the conversation. But in many cultures, I ask the question, and what do I see from Mike? Mike's kind of taken aback a little bit. It's like, dude, this is kind of... This is not normal teaching. I don't want to ask you to get on Saturday. Right? Get to the point? All right, thanks. I'm trying. Okay? So on that, in a lot of cultures, it's not the words that matter, it's the way that the words are said. Right? Difference between high context and low context cultures. The fact that Mike took a little pause before he answered, in many cultures, is a sign that the yes doesn't mean yes. Right? For instance, in a lot of Asian cultures. If I were to ask any Asian student, will you do this thing? I can guarantee you that for almost all of my Asian students, and I'm talking native Asian students, they would say, yes, almost always. But if they pause just a little bit, or perhaps lower their eyes a little bit before the yes comes out, that's actually a no. Okay, so a cosmopolitan communicator is going to be somebody who's available to really interpret these nonverbal signals, these cultural signals that happen, etc., and see that the communication transaction doesn't always mean what I think it means. All right. Inclusive language in your communication transactions. All right, so we're going to ask you to be very, very careful, particularly in your public presentations here, about the style of labels that you use when you're up here. All right, for instance, if you're giving a speech on the state of gay marriage legislation, etc. Currently, the term that's in vogue right now is the LGBT community. And I think it means lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, I think. Not positive. But that's the term that's preferred, LGBT community. All right? Not homosexual. That's problematic for that community. Because for two things. One, it reduces them to nothing more than a sexual preference. That this is the only identifying characteristic for them, is just sexual preference. And there's a lot more to that co-culture than just that. Secondarily, it excludes, for instance, on the bisexual. On homosexual, I only give one choice for sexual attraction. But many people are attracted to both. Right? So the preferred label is one that you want to be sensitive in when you're up here speaking. That you're being inclusive. Because if you're giving a presentation on that, and you happen to have somebody in the class who's a member of that community, immediately you're excluding them from the conversation because they find your label to not honor them, to exclude them from the conversation. So be inclusive in the labels that you use. All right. Also, strive for immediacy in your languages when you're up here presenting. All right, so something this simple creates immediacy. If I were to say this, normal transition, I've just spoken to you about the history of skateboarding in the 1970s. Next, I'll talk to you about the history of skateboarding in the 1980s. That's a nice transition because it looks back and it looks forward. However, I've missed out on an opportunity to create immediacy through my use of language. Instead of I, you, it's better in your presentations if you substitute we and be inclusive. It subtly sends a signal that we're participating in this process together. We have just looked at the history of skateboarding in the 1970s. Next, we'll look at it in the 1980s. Just that subtle shift from I to you into we starts to make the audience more immediate. It reduces that distance between us. All right? So watch that. Be intentional about your use of we. All right. Marginalizing language. This is also very, very common, and you want to make sure that you avoid it in your presentations. So often I've heard it on a subtle level where somebody will come up and they'll say, men often experience this, and then fill in the blanks, and you girls often experience this. There's been a real subtle marginalization that's happened with my use of language. What I've used on the one is men, and on the other hand, I've used girls. Girls talks about a difference in age, right? It's diminutive. You're still small and growing. Men talks about somebody that's actually full grown. And it would have been better to say, my men in the room, whatever it might be, and then the women in the room, whatever it might be. Now we're using equivalent terms and not subtly marginalizing. All right? Media research has shown, particularly in the early 90s, late 80s, this was really a problem. That if, and this is probably going to happen someday, honestly, because as you look out there on the traffic out here in front of CWI right now, sometimes it's tough to get out of here, isn't it? Or it's tough to get in. It's kind of dangerous, actually. All right? So someday you may read a report like this. Johnny Rowing, instructor at College of Western Idaho, was killed in a tragic car accident. Okay? If they do that, typically they report who I am, what I do, and what happened. In the late 80s and early 90s, it was very common to report men based upon their name and their professional role. But if it was something like this, Linda Johnson died today in a tragic car accident in front of CWI. She was the mother of 4 children. 8 years old, 6 years old, 4 years old, whatever it might be. typically ended up being that they would report women based upon their familial relationships and not upon their professional relationships. For all I know, Linda could have been president of the university, but they wouldn't report that. There was a really subtle way that even through media, they marginalized the role of people in society. Change who we are based upon relationships for women and professional endeavors for men. Right? Marginalizing language is something that you want to watch. All right, totalizing language. I've seen this in a couple of presentations. Had one student come forward and talk about saving money on laundry soap and different things that you could do. So she came up and with her totalizing language had said something like this. As you women in the audience know, when you're doing laundry, right? And then later on said, and I know that many of you guys don't ever have to experience this, but it's important to put it on high. Right? But we don't know. Yeah. Okay, so the totalizing language is done there in two big ways. Some of you, I know that whether you're a guy or a girl, some of you don't do laundry anymore at all, right? You either pay for somebody to do it or your parents do it or something like that, and then vice versa, right? It's a faulty assumption for us to come in here and think that based upon these gender lines, we can just totalize to the whole group. That all of the women are the ones doing the laundry, and all of us guys are not. Totalizing language. It's when you make an assumption, you treat a heterogeneous group, a diverse group, as if they're homogenous, as if they only represent one thing. All right? So this is also common with the label Christian, that people would say, okay, you're a Christian, therefore you must be all these other things too. You must be one who's a Republican. You must be one who's against abortion. You must be one who's against gay marriage, etc. But there are many people who accept the word Christian and label for themselves, and they may have a gay or a lesbian pastor. All right, so the label itself doesn't always fit. You can't treat people as if they are just that label. All right, totalizing language is something you want to avoid when you're up here giving your presentations. All right. Down here at the bottom, I don't know if that's, Gabe, can you see that one? Yeah, it's a little low. It's PC on there. And I don't mean personal computer, politically correct. Okay? Most of the time when I say PC, I'll usually get at least one groan from somebody in the audience who's like, oh, I'm so sick of being PC. Right? That's just too PC for me, right? Okay? The term PC is pejorative largely in our society, but I want you to know it's us calm people that care about it. We're the ones who are pushing so far and so hard to make sure that we label things appropriately. Right. And it's largely based upon some institutional research. For instance, it was fairly common back in the day when you go on a flight that you would have a stewardess or a steward. When you go to a restaurant, you would have a waitress or a waiter. Nowadays, we've substituted new things in there, so it's a flight attendant on our flights now, or when you go to a restaurant now, you're on a server, is usually what they are. And we said it's important that we adopt better labels for that, because we said gender has absolutely no impact on whether somebody can be a good steward or a stewardess. And since gender has nothing to do with the occupation, perhaps we should remove those gender labels. And the same thing for waiters and waitresses. It has no real impact on how well you're going to do your job. This is particularly important in light of the fact that a lot of institutional research showed that women were being paid often half as much money for doing the exact same job as men were doing. All right? You can justify this based upon different position. Well, if you ever become a steward, you can get paid steward money, right? If you ever become a stewardess, you can get paid stewardess money, whatever it might be. So there's gendered roles means that there's actually different occupational roles. And they said, well, let's adopt new labels and see if we can break down some of the pay structure. So there's implications in going back to the Sapir Whorf thing, that the words that we use impact the reality that we see. If we start to see people gender first, occupation second, then we're no longer paying attention to the actual occupational roles. We're paying attention to the person in them. All right, so we're the ones who push so hard for it. All right. Still continuing our exploration here of language. Verbal qualifiers. Once again, going back to the research, a lot of data has shown that women are much more likely to use verbal qualifiers. And I see this a lot in my emails, where I'll receive an email from a student, I'm so sorry, or I noticed that you said this test question here, and I might be wrong, but on the reading it says this. Do you think maybe you typed it wrong? Right? Verbal qualifiers, where everything that's said first comes with an apology of sorts or a admittance that I could be wrong. Well, guess what? I know you could be wrong. We all could be wrong. We walk around in a world where none of us are right all the time, although some of us think we are. Right? Okay? So, yeah, verbal qualifiers. All right, so we see this often. And I bring it up because, once again, going back to the institutional research, this can be important for you in your professional life. When you're in department meetings and stuff, watch your verbal qualifiers. Because if you were to say, oh, I'm not really sure about this, but I was just thinking maybe perhaps, and I know I could be wrong, but perhaps if we were to actually stop doing this thing, we could save 10 or 15% of our actual, profits could increase. Right? Eating alive. Okay, if you use that, still the content is good. You've just come up with an idea that might save the company or turn profits up by 10 to 15%. But all the verbal qualifiers that come in diminishes the credibility of your statement. All right, so going back to why there might be this actual occupational gap in pay, sometimes it's not because of the content, but the perception in which that content is delivered. All right, so be really attentive to your use of verbal qualifiers, particularly in your professional life. All right, good grammar. It's also important in your presentations in your life to use good grammar. George Bush, whether you like him or love him, we all know there were times when he just kind of mumbled his way through things. Right? One of the famous errors that he made, he was actually giving a presentation to a group of school teachers. And in the process of that, he says, one thing that's really important, the most important thing of all, we have to ask ourselves, is your children learning? Not good, right? Not good anywhere, because most of us immediately recognize that that's a grammatical error. It should have been, are your children learning? Or is your child learning, etc. But in front of a group of school teachers, it's all that much more important that you be using correct grammar. All right, so when you're up there, be conscious of your grammar to make sure that you're using it correctly. All right, pronunciation. Pronunciation is also important. This is important for a couple of things in presentation. One, make sure you're using words that the at-large world tends to use. All right, so I am a big Pittsburgh Steelers fan, as some of you have already heard. But my father is actually a big fan of the Washington Redskins, who I just talked about too. But they will never be the Washington Redskins to him. He's a big Washington Redskins fan. And he says, I got to go wash my clothes. Right? I got to go to the car wash and get my car cleaned, whatever it might be. All right? So that term wash is widely used in many sections of the country, and that's what Kentucky is widely used there. But when you're giving a presentation up in front of your class, if it's on laundry soap, and you talk about, we're going to help you to diminish the amount of water that you use in your wash by 10 to 15%. It's important when you're washing that you don't get your hot and colds, and people are like, wash, what's going on there? Right? You lose a little bit of credibility. Yeah.
Have you ever asked him to spell wash?
Yes, and he can spell it correctly, thankfully, but he just doesn't pronounce it correctly. All right? All right, so watch your pronunciation. Here's the other big thing that's even more widely applicable. In the course of doing your research, you're going to come across a few authors with names that you don't know. Could be some Swedish dude, Jan Jorgensen, right? And that's going to be spelled with an S-O-E-N with these funny little like smiley faces on top and two little dots, whatever it might be, and you're like, I don't know how to pronounce this thing, right? Find out, if you can, how to actually correctly pronounce these names, right? Because you don't want to come up here and talk about Albert Einstein, right? Or Albert Camus, right? So you want to make sure that you can find these pronunciations. However, if you know that you just can't find it, and you don't believe that anybody in here is likely to know who Jan Jorgensen is, go ahead and pronounce it the way that you think it should be pronounced. And don't stumble over it. And according to you, you've had like two weeks, a month to prepare for these speeches. So I don't want to hear you come up and say, in a 1997 article delivered by Johan Jorgensen. I don't want you to do that, okay? Practice the pronunciation that you think is most likely. Sell out to it according to a 1997 article by Johan Jorgensen. And then just move on, right? Don't highlight the fact that it's hard to pronounce. Pronounce it the way that you think it should be pronounced and move on, right? And Johann is actually very thin. All right, I'm just kidding. All right, so usage. Another thing that some of you are going to be tempted to do is to really make yourself sound smart when you're up here by using good vocabulary and things like that. And that's fine. I actually want you to. I want you to call yourself to a higher level of learning, a little bit new vocabulary, etc. You should be learning while they're learning. No problem with that. However, just make sure it's correct. All right, so if you're giving an informative speech on helping to alleviate stress during those first, couple of weeks on campus, don't tell people about the orientation process and say something like this. And even from my personal experience, when I was orientated, I found out that orientated was very, very important for my success as a student. So orientated is not a word. Okay? All right, so make sure these words you're using that you think are very, very impressive are actually real vocabulary. Okay? If you want me to use them if you want to, but just make sure that you're checking them out first. Because you can lose a lot of ethos and credibility through that. All right, yes.
Make sure you also sound like it fits. I've seen a lot of reports where they put in all these huge words that are really impressive by themselves, but when put into the rest of the sentence, it just sounds like you're an idiot.
Yes.
You just picked up words at random in the dictionary.
Sure, and I doubt that most of us are going to get to a level where we're just like throwing out all these big vocabulary words for no purpose whatsoever. But just do watch it. Make sure that you've got a grasp on the language and push yourself above your capabilities. All right? Other things that you can do to make your language kind of pop and be more powerful. One, you can use metaphor. All right, so a metaphor. For instance, if I'm giving a speech on environmentalism, I can talk about we are polluting our environment. This is important. However, if I'm talking about old growth rainforests, I probably should have said something like this. And right now, we're in the midst of raping our virgin timberland. I've got everybody's attention now. Like, what are they doing to the timber? Well, that's just crazy. Right? Give me something that's actually got a little more power. Right? So you can use a metaphor. You just describe it. All right. Simile is where you compare one thing to another. Like a child with a chainsaw is one who has knowledge without wisdom. A simile. All right? So you can use that to also give power to your presentations. You can use an analogy. An analogy is basically an extended simile or an extended metaphor. I gave you an example about this earlier, that one way you could organize the speeches. Like with a computer, to give it spatially, and you can compare it to how a warehousing system works. All right, so it's an analogy that we're using. Right, so the CPU is like the dispatcher, the freeways are like the motherboard, a hard drive is like the warehouse, etc. And you can use it as an extended metaphor. And we talked about this at length too. Sensory and action words, using taste, touch, smell, sight, sound. And don't just say I was, I am. Use those Zoom board action words, where there's actually motion and movement. Be intentional in that. All right, alliteration is another very common way for you to add power to your presentation. And you don't have to do this everywhere. In fact, I just said power to your presentation. That's an alliteration. Where two words are using the same sound back to back or more. All right, so only dummies do drunk driving. Dummies do drunk driving. It's that same D sound repeated over and over again. Obviously, this can go a little too far. If you're like Peter Piper, picked the peppers. Could be a problem, right? Get away from those P's. Don't go too far. But every once in a while, ask yourself, is there an opportunity here for you to put a quick alliterative sentence in here that will really make the presentations pop more? Right? Adds a lot of variety. Parallelism, I talked to you about that. That's the one where the first part of the sentence and the second part of the sentence are basically saying the same thing. These are tools of invention that you can use to close your speech, but you can also put these in the body of your speech to just give it a little more variety and a little more power. All right, so parallelism. Antithesis, that's where the first part of the sentence and the second part of the sentence say the exact opposite. All right, so for parallelism, we can achieve, together we succeed. Antithesis, a few will fall, but most will succeed. Right?
Most will rise.
Most will rise, most will stand, whatever it might be, do the exact opposite. Repetition. Very common in speeches to use. You have this opportunity to use it in yours as well. Political speeches use them all the time. In fact, Obama used it with great success recently. His little catchphrase was, "Yes, we can." And he would intersperse that little catchphrase in a lot of his different things. Is it possible for us to adopt universal health care and help the poorest of America to rise above their current living standards? Yes, we can. Is it possible for us to bring peace to the Middle East and to fight global terrorism around the globe so that new generations will experience democracy flourishing across the globe? Yes, we can. And that "yes, we can" statement would go on and would be restated over the course of this presentation to add a little more power. Okay? Music. Don't forget in your vocal delivery to make sure that you're using vocal variety. The last thing you want to do is talk at the same pace and the same tone for too long, because if you do that, pretty soon you're going to lose your audience. You're going to have to put your content in. Right now, I'm going to make this for about 20 seconds. I know that most of you are like, "Oh, this please go."
Can you talk that way the whole thing? That'd be awesome.
It's hard for me to do that the whole time with monotone, because every once in a while I start to get it.
I'll give you $2 if you do it.
I don't think it's worth the money.
All right. And
Humor is another thing that you can use to actually present in your class to spice things up. Just make sure that your humor is actually appropriate. All right? We don't want to hear a bunch of inappropriate racial jokes out here and stuff. We don't want to hear stuff that's more appropriate for the sorority and the fraternity when you're already 3 sheets to the wind. All right? So watch your humor in here. It can actually be beneficial. And the other thing is always, always, always make sure that it connects back to your thesis statement. So we talked about that already. So please use your humor in a good way. All right. Are there questions? All right, well, really, when I get back to the office today, I think I'm going to snack on a little bit of candy. I have a whole bag of candy, which is an encouragement. If you ever want to come by and just say hello, you can also grab a little bit of candy. Even though I have a lot of sugar always around me, my wife is a nutrition major, which is kind of ironic. And she tells me that actually one of the best vegetables you can eat is spinach. All right? So I say there's lots and lots of nutrients, particularly if you eat it raw and don't cook out all the nutrients and stuff. So, like Popeye's spinach, this class is spinach. Thank you all.